Hi, I'm Anthony Brandt. I'm here today with Marvin Bell, my friend, who is a poet and essayist. He's also the Flannery O'Connor Professor of Letters at the University of Iowa. He's been teaching at the Iowa Writers' Workshop for 30 years, which makes you probably the most tenured person there, doesn't it?
The oldest.
Yes. Marvin has written 9 books of poetry. Do I have that right?
Depends how you count.
Okay. We won't quibble about numbers here. His most recent books, and I'm going to put them both up so the camera can linger on them. This is a Marvin Bell Reader, which contains selected poetry and prose, and it's a substantial book and a very nice one. And then a much more dramatic book of poems called The Book of the Dead Man, and these have both come out within the last year. And anyway, we're going to talk about poetry and all kinds of things. I want to start by pointing out that Marvin grew up in Center Moriches. He's a Long Island boy. His father ran a 5 and 10 cent store. Is that right?
That's right. He had a 5 and 10 in Center Moriches, right there on Main Street where Union Avenue comes to it. And he also had a summer store, which he kept open for the convenience of the customers in the winters down in Mastic Beach.
Really?
Tough place.
Yeah. Well, you mention that every time you talk about going to Mastic Beach and Shirley. It's like, this is very tough with chain link fences and the old refrigerators sitting on the lawns and beat up old cars.
There are different kinds of Long Island neighborhoods.
Yeah. It ain't all plantations and roses, is it?
That's right. But it is true. I grew up here, and it was a good place to grow up. As you know, Long Island then was mostly fishermen and potato farms and duck farms, and small business people who took care of people in other ways. The island's changed a lot, of course.
Mm. And you also have a home in Port Townsend, Washington, as well as living in Iowa during the academic year, and then in the summers in
Oh,
Washington.
yeah, we feel really spoiled. I stopped teaching summer school 10 years ago, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been going all the way out to Port Townsend. It's on the tip of the Quimper Peninsula, which is a bump northward off the larger Olympic Peninsula above Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
We drive it. We drive Route 90 across the country, and it's spectacular. We've done this now 10 years back and forth, and we're still not tired of it.
And you spend winter vacations here.
Oh, yes.
In East Hampton.
Now I'm going to feel even more spoiled. What happened is, finally, after many, many years of having our cake and eating it too, that is, having at least one of our 2 sons living at home or somewhere nearby, finally they were both really out of the house, out of the town, and gone, and the little one had moved to New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way home from helping him move, we thought, hold it. We don't have to stay in Iowa City between semesters.
That's right.
Let's go out to Long Island, and we'll lure him out on weekends. And I do have good friends here.
So, you're tri-coastal.
We are.
Way, yes.
It's a little embarrassing to admit, but we are, yes.
What a fate for a poet, huh?
Dumb luck has been on my side.
Yeah, okay. Deserved, I think. I wanted to read something from the Marvin Bell Reader. It's a section, I think this is from Pages. This is from Pages, which, as I understand it, was a book or a notebook that you kept during a certain period of time.
Yeah, my idea was to keep a kind of journal, but it would have the tone of prose poetry when it was written in prose, and it would sometimes accommodate lines, and a page would be the form. That is, what fit on a page would be on a page. But of course, I didn't really keep track of things that way, so some pages take more than a page, depending, of course, on how big a page it is, physically speaking. But that was the idea, that a page could have several things together, and they would all relate to one another.
Well, let me read this, which is about explaining his typewriter.
Oh,
Because
okay.
there's something in here that I want to cue off on. Explaining his typewriter, he explains that he has brought along a travel typewriter that he bought years before from J.H., who earlier published a long piece in Life on the poet John Berryman. Berryman was pictured in Ireland sporting a long gray beard grown abroad. He liked that article enough to save it. Now, he thought, could my typewriter be the very one on which she wrote so well of Berryman? He telephoned her, perhaps too early in the morning. But she was pleasant. Could it be? Well, she said, I had that typewriter then. It may be that it was. Yes, let's say that it was. Now, he says that it was, but then he tells the story also. Sometimes he goes straight to the story. Life is not a list of events, but a continuum. Yet he would have to live in a rainforest alone not to see his own life as a series of events in a context, a continuum called life. These events happen quickly, a few minutes now and then, even if they unfold in stages over years, but the stories that contain them surround them with life. So after a while, rather than reporting an event, he tells the story of the event. The event passes beyond its normal boundaries. Also, it continues. Today, as he tells again the story of his typewriter, he is once more experiencing the question, could it be? And again, the special answer in between yes and no. Let's say that it was, and that's what I want to key on. That special answer in between yes and no, let's say that it was. And for me, that evokes something about the nature of poetry itself, which is in between yes and no, a kind of holding back of total assertion and not yet denying anything. Am I getting close? Have I struck a
Well,
chord
makes sense
here?
to me. Poetry tries to get beyond language. Why do that? Well, using your terms, which do make sense to me, the world forces you to say yes or no most of the time. The world has no way of accommodating, well, maybe, and yes and no, and so forth. But life is not that simple. Things aren't black and white, as people like to say. And it's complex. It's not all subject to verbal analysis.
Yeah.
Much of our knowledge is not verbal. Much of our language is not verbal. Sounds we make, grunts, all
Grunts,
kinds of
gestures, all kinds of things,
things.
yes.
Sure. And there are a lot of words you can't look up in the dictionary. So poetry in particular, I think all art tries to get beyond the materials to something bigger, greater, more complex. Not necessarily complicated, but complex. But poetry does this with a vengeance, because language by its nature has a possibility of what we take to be precision. But even that precision, glorious as it is not the whole story.
And the complexity that you're trying to, in a sense, describe is not the right word either, because it's more than describe, and it's also more than express. To embody in some way in language is, how do I want to say it? It's what leads to the charge of obscurity, I think, in modern poetry, that that it's hard to understand, that it's hard to figure out what exactly is going on in the poem. And yet it seems to me that what's going on in the poem is really a simulacrum of what is going on inside that complexity, or it's an attempt to reach that, to create such a simulacrum.
Well, one of the salient characteristics of modern poetry, and even more so what might be called contemporary poetry, is that one can see the author's mind at work. I mean, poetry has always been a graph of the mind, but often it was a graph of the mind when the mind chose to be still for a moment and summarize. But increasingly, contemporary poetry has been a matter for many poets of, I don't know how to say it. I mean, catching the moment, that's too frivolous. Being spontaneous, no. Of starting without, as one never knew the end point, without knowing the end point, and making visible the progress. allowing the progress of the mind, the heart, the words, whatever it is, allowing the progress of the poem toward some kind of awareness or embodiment or summation, whatever it is, toward whatever it's going to, allowing that progress to be visible. And this can look pretty obscure to those of us, all of us, I suppose, who were brought up on textbook examples of poetry, which could be paraphrased, and which were indeed invited into the classroom in direct proportion to how easily they could be paraphrased.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that poetry, I mean, you know, we're all familiar with it from Keats and Wordsworth and all the famous examples going back as far as you want to go, is a made poetry in the sense that it's made out of rhetorical principles and a kind of structure that was fairly solid that you could rely on into which you fit whatever you had to say. And those rules started to disappear 100 years ago, in France first, and then in England and elsewhere, and finally here. And you got something that does illustrate the poet's mind at work. And I'm wondering how you teach that as a teacher. How do you deal with that?
Same way elephants make love, very carefully.
Right.
Well, do you teach it? I don't know.
Well, you can't teach that.
It can get learned.
It can get
learned. It is learned all the
Uh-huh.
time. So, and the learning seems to go on in the presence of teaching most of the time. So, it's just I don't quite want to step over and take any credit for it. But I think the teaching of creative writing, in particular writing of poetry, requires a certain jujitsu and a certain zen and a certain indirection and a certain chaos,
Mm-hmm.
creative chaos. You know, a lot depends on the group, of course. I just finished a semester at the university where I teach with a workshop that I just adored, and they adored each other. I could have gone on forever with this same group. They're just wonderful and amazingly productive, able to say anything to each other, clearly on each other's side. At the same time, they were brilliant, individually and as a group. And it just, everyone could feel that this was working, this dynamic was working. It's not always that way. There are times when certain people within a group will take a lot out of the class, and others will get very little. And indeed, there are times when, you know, one person's progress will cost another person in a way. There are all kinds of dynamics that are possible to teaching, as I'm sure you know. I do know more about it now than I did when I started teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know if I can put what I know into words. There are many ways. It really depends on the student at hand, the context of his or her writing. You know, it may depend on the weather. It may depend on something that seems to have nothing to do with the content at hand that happens in the first few minutes of the class. It may depend on moving the chairs. Believe me, I know that sounds crazy. There are different ways to pull the rug out from under someone.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have to know all these ways. You know, they say in the martial arts, you don't own a move until you've done it 10,000 times. I feel something like that about teaching.
Yeah, I know how hard it is. I tried it once, and I was terrible at it. And
I doubt that.
no, I was poor. I mean, this is a fact. An embarrassing fact, but a fact. I just didn't have a clue as to how to go about it. I was teaching freshman composition. That was a long time ago.
Well, that's tough.
And
That's a tough
I didn't
one.
know what to do with people who didn't understand the language and didn't know how to use it and put it together, because
Yeah.
I did all that instinctively.
Sure.
I always seem to know how to do that, and as a result, I don't have any craft. I simply do what I do. But I was thinking about what you said about poetry, about the teaching of it. A question I had about that was, when it is the movement of the mind that you're teaching, or not that you're teaching, but that is being exposed in modern poetry, how do you tell good movements from bad movements, so to speak? You have a person says, well, this is my thought about this subject. These are my thoughts. This is the way my mind works. What's wrong with it?
Well,
why isn't it as good as something that, John Ashbery or Galway Kinnell writes? How do you deal with that as a teacher?
Yeah, you should ask that, because when we start talking about a graph of the mind as opposed to meter and rhyme and so forth, that kind of talk can be used vaguely to justify almost anything. And of course, that's not what we're doing. Well, the best way to hold up standards is to bring in work that's good. It's very difficult to explain to a student why his or her poems aren't as good as they think they are unless they have seen poems that are better. And indeed, I occasionally teach an undergraduate poetry workshop to which admission is limited, no matter who's teaching it, to those who get in with manuscripts. Its applications by manuscript. Well, inevitably, people who don't get in, especially if they got in for the class previously when some other teacher was teaching it, are very disturbed. And I get phone calls at home, and some of them really want to talk about this. And of course, there's no way to explain it to them. But what I've learned to do is, I say, well, come by the office tomorrow. And when they come by, I say, well, I have to go down the hallway for a while. Here are some manuscripts from the people who got in. Why don't you take a look at them? And by the time I come back, they understand.
They're nodding their heads as if to say, yeah.
They can see that something more is being asked of the language in the manuscripts of those who got in. And, I mean, ultimately, look, how did we learn to speak? We heard other people speak. Any good jazz musician would listen to everything he or she could get their hands on. As we're doing this, I'm thinking he, she, there. Yeah, the language can't do everything, can it? He or she can get their hands on. Am I going to say he or she can get his or her hands on?
Well, the worst thing is to he/she or one of these
or S/HE. Or,
yes,
I know.
yes.
The language can't do everything. Just as there's a note you can't play on the violin. If you have it tuned in a certain key, there's a note you can't play. Well, where were we? What were we talking about?
Teaching.
Oh my goodness, teaching. Yeah, slides from.
He
one
says
of mine.
vaguely, yes.
But what specifically?
Well, it's interesting what you were saying. It's a question of how we know what we know.
Oh.
And we do know what's good work and what isn't work, and how we know that is very difficult to say. But a lot of it has to do with being exposed to a great deal of it.
Okay. Any good jazz musician would listen to everyone. If they couldn't find the person at a club, they'd listen to the person's CD or tape or whatever. Poets have to understand, young writers in any form have to understand that they have to read good work. Which particular pieces of good work, that's up to them. There's so much. But they have to read good work to see how people have done it. I mean, if you're really a great basketball player, sooner or later you have to play against people who are just as good. If you're really a great tennis player, sooner or later you're going to have to move to a warm climate and get a great coach. But with writing, it's easier because it's all right there in the library. You can play with the best all the time.
Yeah. Except it's not easier. It's much harder to do it well, as you know, as we both know.
But you don't have to move.
Yeah.
I want to double back a little because, there's still many fine, wonderful formalists in the sense of those who write in meter and rhyme and are committed to it.
You're right.
And there's no reason to abandon meter and rhyme. There's no reason to put all one's eggs in the basket of free verse or the basket of meter and rhyme. But one of the signals that contemporary poetry has sent the world of its very contemporaneousness is this visibility of process.
Yeah.
I think this is true in all the arts. And a lot of that has had to do with what is called free verse. People often think of free verse as anything that isn't metered and rhymed, and then they sort of don't think about it anymore. That's it. If it's not metered and rhymed, we'll call it free verse. But the fact of the matter is that free verse is a method for finding many forms, some of which may be particular only to that poem.
Mm-hmm.
There are many kinds of free verse, and there are the possibilities of many more kinds. So it has a lot to do with, it can even have to do with the metabolism of the poet. It can have to do with some kind of count that can't be known by the reader necessarily, but is known to the poet. It can come from an attitude like that expressed by Denise Levertov in a famous essay about free verse years ago, in which he likened it to organic form. That is, it evolved naturally as, say, a flower might.
Mm-hmm.
And this has a lot to do with idiomatic phrasing. I mean, one can be very syncopated and jazzy. One can be Whitmanian and biblical. There's so many possibilities.
There are a lot of possibilities. I'm thinking of W.S. Merwin, who doesn't use punctuation and is able to use the line then to fiddle with the line in interesting ways. It's not always interesting, it doesn't always work, and after a while it gets to seem like a tick, or it can. But at its best, it can be used very creatively to both run on thought and to syncopate it in a funny way, if you know what I mean, where a phrase works both ways, both backwards and forwards.
That's right. We make use of syntactical ambiguity.
That's right.
Positional ambiguity. William Cross Williams did a lot of that, and deliberately as an experiment, and did it wonderfully. Merwin, of course, comes from that wonderful generation, a very big generation of many, many people who, well, it's just, I don't know how to say it, they're just a great generation of great poets that Merwin belongs to, ahead of mine. And they all began in meter and rhyme. Many of them weren't that good at it. Those who were the best, of course, kept right on writing it. But they were all pretty good.
Yeah, that's a generation of the 50s.
Yes.
When I was going to college, when we were both going to college, that's what was important. A very sort of formal mastery was required of you.
Absolutely.
And that's when I started to write poetry, and more or less when I stopped also.
Do you think those two things are related?
Possibly, I don't know. That's what I thought I had to do, and that's what I did, was to try and master those formal forms, if you will.
Yeah, and it would still be a good apprenticeship. It would be a perfectly good apprenticeship. I think most young poets want to try something else too.
Right. Oh, one of the reasons that I brought up the question of why isn't my work as good as someone else's is that there is a kind of political scene in the poetry world, as you know, where people with political axes to grind feel that their work is valuable simply because they have something political to say and should be honored for that reason and not for the quality of the poetry itself. And I'm wondering how much of a problem that's becoming where you are, you know, in the university world.
Well, I think it's probably a matter, an issue, an event, a phenomenon everywhere. The particular program I teach in welcomes, the students in it are so brilliant and so eccentric and so crazy, their standards are so high that whether they also have a political agenda is extra. I'm not saying this very well, Tony, but it's not a problem for me where I teach. And I don't know if I even want to think of it as a problem, because I think these are cultural forces that we have no say over.
Right.
It is true that you know, it may be that the people who are promoting multiculturalism in literature are on the side of the angels. Surely they intend to be. And it may be that they feel certain accomplishments can go unappreciated for the sake of others which have been unappreciated previously, or which would enrich in our scene. There are cultural forces that overwhelm literary standards. And in some cases, people might argue, and they might be right, that some of these cultural forces contain better literary standards. I mean, very difficult for us to see. You know, we think Keats is great. 200 years from now, they may wonder why we liked his work. This happens.
This I know, yes.
You know, I mean, literary values are caught up in a matrix of social, cultural values, political values, founding fathers and mothers' values, and so forth, psychological values, I don't know. So, you know, I'm in it for the philosophy. I'm in it for the thinking. I'm in it for the emotional awareness that is beyond the words themselves. I'm in it for all of that. So I'm a very literary sort of guy, you know, in that respect. Other people may be in it to express a culture they come from. Other people may be in it to change society. And poetry has never managed to do that. Sometimes it takes a little credit afterwards, but it's
The
not what happens.
unacknowledged legislators of the world, right?
Exactly. On the other hand, Auden's wrote some famous lines, poetry makes nothing happen. It exists in the valley of our saying, and so forth. There's no right or wrong about this. Poetry, there's no one way to write, there's no right way to write. People do get into big arguments about it because they feel that worthy writers are being neglected for the sake of fashionable writers. And indeed, in publishing today, that's probably true. I think.
Well, that's always been true, though.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the way it is. If you're going to be an artist, you're not going to be Alexander the Great. Even if your name is Alex. I think these are interesting aspects of this whole phenomenon, but for those of us who write, as you know well, when you're writing, you're writing. And whether or not the society out there is going to be interested in your literary standards or going to want to read what you've written for the moment has to be held at arm's length.
Yes.
You know?
You can't have those sort of purposes in the front of your mind.
That's right. Your only recourse may be to write letters later on to the East Hampton Star.
That's right. An open forum. I was thinking on the way over here how I could characterize your work, and I'm hard put to do that because it seems to me your work is very various. You write wonderful essays, and you write wonderful poetry, and up to a point it has been of a certain kind, and then I feel you made a real departure with the Book of the Dead Man. I did, looking through your book this morning, I came upon this other thing that you had written. Actually, if I continue on with the first quote, it does say something about what I think of as your style or your métier or maybe your subject matter. I don't know. It's too difficult to put a phrase to this. But let me continue. Today, as he tells again the story of his typewriter, he is once more experiencing the question, could it be? And again, the special answer in between yes and no. Let's say that it was. And again, the delight in having one's cake and eating it too, in enlarging the events of life without lying about them to oneself. And all of this once more for the first time. About his poems, C was amazed, she said, by how he could make poems out of so little. Bits of string and thread and some dust from under the bed. And that struck me, reading your earlier work, always, that you could make such beautiful poetry out of such what seemed to be small domestic events. And it seemed to be what you were about as a poet. And in a little while, I'm hoping you will read some things for us. But before we get to that, then I read the Book of the Dead Man, and it was such a departure. There's nothing domestic about it. It's much more gnomic, if that's the proper word. It's much stronger and it's also very hard to describe, except from a formal way. And, well, let me do that. Each of these Dead Man poems, and they're numbered, comes in a very, each has the same structure. I'm looking at one called About the Dead Man and Mirrors, and then there's a second part, more about the dead man and mirrors, and every poem is like that. It runs from, and the subjects are about the dead man and dreams, the dead man's advice, about the dead man in winter. Every poem has a second part, more about the dead man in winter. Each line is a full sentence. In most poetry, of course, the sentences are broken up and it runs down the page. Here you've done something which appears on the surface to be Whitman-esque, but doesn't read like Whitman at all, which is a very long line, depending upon the length of the sentence. And this seems like such a departure, and such, and I also think such a breakthrough. How did this happen?
Good
Can you
question.
tell me? I mean, can anyone say how these things happen?
Yeah, I can say a few things that are, in the neighborhood anyway.
Okay.
I mean, one is just would be just to tell the narrative of it. The first one I wrote was in the previous book called Iris of Creation. It was written a few years before I wrote another one.
Mm-hmm.
And it was called About the Dead Man. Part 2 is called More About the Dead Man.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. I titled it From the Book of the Dead Man, but there was no such thing, nor had I anything, nor had I it in mind to write the Book of the Dead Man. And I remember Dorothy, my wife, looked at it and said, "You ought to write some more of these," but I wasn't ready to think about it, so I poo-pooed the idea. But one thing led to another, and a few years later I went back and wrote another one, and then I wrote another one, and I began to discover what was in the form. Again, literary values are part of what I do. This doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to do with self-expression, except insofar as it can be tricked out by literary values. And so the formal elements of it, the sentence is a line, the line is a sentence, the two parts, the bipartite or bifocal or stereoptical, is that a word, stereoptical?
Mm-hmm.
Viewpoint, the philosophic nature of it. I said before, I confessed before, I blurted it right out here on television for everybody to hear that I'm in it for the philosophy, among other things, and I am.
Mm-hmm.
That's what has interested me about poetry. Is it a metaphysical characteristic of poetry, or is it something else? But it's the philosophic import of poetry that is embedded somehow in the very texture of the physical world. It's right there in the physical world. And indeed, I just put a manuscript together to be published in Ireland. I called it Wednesday.
Wednesday, I like that.
Well, there's a poem called Wednesday about going home in the middle of the week with books of noble ideas under your arm, and then coming back to work. And I've just lost my train of thought, I realized.
But the philosophy, that's
yes,
that's a memorable
the
phrase.
books of noble ideas. And in the poem, there's a suggestion made that the higher good and the greater good contended as sap on the maple, and even I was enabled to witness this. And there's an implication that this is because you take some books home to read,
Mm-hmm.
So poets aren't supposed to be in it for the philosophy, but there's no doubt that philosophy and poetry are pretty close cousins.
Well, Sir John Davies and many others in the Renaissance, I studied those folks, and it was philosophical poetry. It was, let's write some philosophy, but put it in verse. And they did it extremely well and with considerable interest.
Okay, now what if we promote that into the contemporary sense of things, in which the very process of the mind, the very process is visible, the very process of writing is visible, the progress of any philosophical thought is visible as it develops. What if we put that into the poetry so that one is philosophical, but it isn't a summary of what one has already thought? It's
Right.
not a fine expression of what one already knows, but a lurching toward what one didn't know one knew. In this case, of course, the Book of the Dead Man kicks off with a Zen admonition as an epigraph: live as if you were already dead.
Where did you find that?
I don't know. I've known it for a long time, and in the martial arts, one is sometimes taught to fight as if one were already dead.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that kind of confidence is necessary. When I went looking for I've asked people where I should go to look for it again, and I haven't been able to find it exactly. I've found versions of it. But it's a well-known Zen admonition. I mean, it is integral to that Zen sense of non-attachment, even as you take happy part,
Mm-hmm.
Even as you participate completely and have fun doing it, there's still always somewhere a non-attachment. Maybe that's only the solitude that Rilke talks about. Though I think Rilke's solitude drips, and this kind of non-attachment doesn't drip.
Yes.
You can't squeeze any liquid out of it. So there's a viewpoint, there's a stance, there's a philosophy, if that's not too long a word for it. And all of those things have always interested me.
Well, you've written something here in another pages, or another piece of pages, which struck me as being apropos to this change. You say, in poetry, what is sometimes mistakenly called silence is in fact interval. Cage, that's John Cage, attributing his sense of composition to a remark by Thoreau, music is continuous, only listening is intermittent. That's a beautiful remark, by the way.
Isn't it?
A silence that is not an interval will be available to all of us soon enough. We interrupt it with our lives. I would prefer a poetry that knows this without taking it for its subject. Give us the drone of death, and we will work enough variations in the higher notes to make you forget there ever was a night in which you were asleep.
You're going to help me figure out how I came to write the Book of the Dead Man, because those journal pages were written the same winter that I wrote the first Book of the Dead Man poem.
Okay, that was the winter that you, well, I haven't mentioned this, but you spent a winter alone, didn't you?
Pretty much, in Port Townsend, Washington.
In Port Townsend?
Yeah.
Which is a bleak place to spend the winter.
In those days in particular, Port Townsend was a bleak place in the winter, and the Northwest in general, especially that high up in the Northwest, that sky clouds over and one doesn't see any blue
Right.
for a long time, and the wind tries to tear the flag to shreds up at the post office, you know. But it probably was a time in my life. It probably was the time of the year. It was probably the locale. It was the geographic and psychological and emotional coordinates all at the same time, you know.
Mm-hmm. And solitude.
And solitude for the most part too. That's right. Yeah. But those things are written at the same time, as a matter of fact. That's right.
And the drone of death is, here it is. I mean, this is
right.
sort of bringing it out to make sure that we all understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah. You know, I also like abstract language. I like surrealism. I like abstract language. I like the kind of spontaneity which could almost seem to be giggles, but it isn't. Mm-hmm. It turns out to be very serious. You know about me because we're friends that I like to kid around.
Right.
And I'll kid around about the most serious things. But underneath, there's a serious book. But there are funny things in it.
Yes, yes.
Kierkegaard said laughter was a kind of prayer. Let me double way back for a moment.
Okay.
J.H. is someone who lives out here.
Really?
J.H. who sold me my travel typewriter that I later realized might have been the typewriter on which he wrote the great article by John Berryman. It's Jane Howard.
Jane Howard, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought of that.
And I still have that typewriter.
And that's the kind of remark that she would make too. Let's say that it might have been, or let's
terrific.
say that it was.
Let's say that it is. I loved it.
Right.
She wasn't going
Jane's-
to deprive me
Jane's
of
wonderful.
that pleasure.
Yes. Do we have time? Would you like to do a little reading?
If you'd like, whatever you like.
I think that would be wonderful. Why don't you choose what we've got? I've
Oh.
brought a whole bunch of things
Oh my
here.
goodness! Don't make me do this because I don't know how. I could just take something out. What I could do is read one poem that isn't a Dead Man poem and one or part of one that is.
Okay, I think we have a little time that you could actually read a little bit more than one or two.
Well, we could talk back and forth. I think if you ask most poets why they wrote a particular poem, how they came to write it, they're usually ready with an answer. They've figured out an answer. But I don't believe they're answers because I know how people actually write. Because of where I've been teaching and what I've been teaching and who I've been teaching for 30 years and all the trips I've gone on to be part of festivals and conferences and the lectures and the readings and the classes elsewhere and so forth. I know how poets write, not just student poets. I know how the poets of my generation write.
Mm-hmm.
I know where they sit. I know when they do it. I know what music they listen to. And I know that they're fibbing when they talk about the great philosophic plans that they've made.
Right.
These are things they've recognized after the fact. And I don't tend to look back to see how I came to write what I wrote. I do read my work later on as a reader. I have the advantage of being the first reader, that's all.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you come upon this passage in pages and you say to me, well, look at this in relation to having written the Book of the Dead Man, all of a sudden I realized, holy smoke, yes, indeed, I was writing those things at the same time. And I know I was reading some of Frisch's notebooks, Max Frisch's notebooks.
Right.
And I think all that came together. The other day someone said to me, there's a poem, maybe I'll read it right now. There's a poem called The Self and the Mulberry from years ago, which contains the line, I wanted to be there and not there. Well, being there and not being there at the same time is part and parcel of the Book of the Dead Man.
Yes, there's this paradoxical position and desire that
That's
that
right.
is expressed throughout.
The dead man is alive and dead at the same time.
Right.
Or at least
So
the
that-
dead
so
man
that-
are waiting.
When I'm talking about a sort of a departure from your usual style in the Book of the Dead Man, there really isn't that much of a departure in the sense that you are continuing to be preoccupied with things you have always been preoccupied
That's true.
with.
That's true.
And it's simply taken a different and perhaps more difficult form.
That's true. I think you're right. And as you know, I'm going on with it. I've continued to write what I call dead man poems. Neither the concept nor the form seem to me so far to have been exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm continuing with it. And I can imagine I might continue with it forever.
Why not?
Why not? I like that. That's the epigraph finally for all books.
Yes.
Why not? I can give you, let's see, maybe I can do something interesting here if I can find it. I was reading from the Book of the Dead Man on a stage a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. To my right was a radio setup. The reading was going out live on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of equipment up there, and a woman who was running the program. And she would occasionally speak to me, and I would jump every time because I kept forgetting she was there on the stage with me. And she asked me a question I wasn't prepared for, and I thought, this really makes sense. A very, very early poem called Treetops, one of the first of many poems that one might call father poems. The question is, can I find it here in this index, which has no, which is not alphabetical. Here it is. This is a poem from, who knows, 30 years ago. It's called Treetops. My father moves for the south hunting duck. It is warm. He has appeared like a ship surfacing, where he floats face up through the ducklands. Over the tops of trees, duck will come, and he strains not to miss seeing the first of each flock, although it will be impossible to shoot one from such an angle. Face up like that, in a floating coffin where the lid obstructs half a whole view if he has a gun. Afterlives are full of such hardships. One meets, for example, in one's sinlessness, high water, and our faithlessness. So the dead wonder if they're imagined, but they are not quite. How could they know we know, when the earth shifts deceptively to set forth ancestors to such pursuits? My father will be asking, is this fitting? And I think so, I who, with the others, coming on the afterlife after the fact, in a dream, in a probable volume of dreams, think so. Well, the lady who was running the radio show said, do the Dead Man poems come from this? And I can't remember what her reasoning was behind the question, but it made a lot of sense to me, and I thought, oh my goodness, maybe they do. I did write a number of poems to and about my father, who had died before I began to write poetry.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
There are
Well-
some things we can't know about the processes that go on.
No.
It's
And
simply
it's
hidden
just as
from us.
well. What good would it be if we did?
Yes,
know
exactly. We
everything,
might
right?
want to tamper with them.
Yeah, that's what
should be a
makes poetry
disaster.
wonderful, that it's essentially a gratuitous art form. Yes, it's true, some poets end up with a lot of money from fellowships nowadays or big prizes.
Money
But-
for poets?
Yes.
You're joking, aren't you?
It is possible now.
Really?
But in general, it's a gratuitous art form. Perhaps not as quite as gratuitous as being a contemporary composer is. And that means that if you go on writing poetry, you do it because you need to, because you have to, because it's important.
Which makes it a free act. Gratuitous is has two meanings here.
Exactly.
I mean, it's useless, but it's also free.
Absolutely. This is the place where you really are free, where you get to talk to yourself, where you can transcend time, be someone else, be somewhere else, consider any possibility. Absolutely. And, we'll never be free in our outer lives, my goodness. Okay, what was I looking for? I wanted to read my little poem to Dorothy. I always try to stick this in when I get to...
Well, it's a classic. It's one of them. It's truly beautiful.
This is to Dorothy. You are not beautiful exactly. You are beautiful inexactly. You let a weed grow by the mulberry, and a mulberry grow by the house. So close, in the personal quiet of a windy night, it brushes the wall and sweeps away the day till we sleep. A child said it, and it seemed true. Things that are lost are all equal. But it isn't true. If I lost you, the air wouldn't move nor the tree grow. Someone would pull the weed, my flower. The quiet wouldn't be yours. If I lost you, I'd have to ask the grass to let me sleep. Now, shall we make another sound here?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you have an idea, or should I just pick one out?
I'll let you choose.
Let's see.
This is... One of these copies is the one I used to review your... So it has notes in it. If you find that... Oh, that's this one.
No, I don't see any in here. Well, let's see. Too many of them. Let's see. About the dead man government, about the dead man nurse.
How about number 6?
Number 6, about the dead man's speech. Okay. Will the dead man speak? Speak, says the lion, and the dead man makes the sound of a paw in the dirt. When the dead man paws the dirt, lions feel the trembling of the pride. Speak, says the tree, and the dead man makes the sound of tree bark enlarging its circumference, a slight inhalation. Speak, says the wind, and the dead man exhales all at once. Whoever told the dead man to be quiet was whistling in the dark. To the dead man, the dark is all words, as white as all colors. The dead man obliges, he cooperates, he speaks when spoken to. So when the dirt says speak, he says what erosion says. And when the air says speak, the dead man says what a cavity says. The dead man knows the syntax of rivers and rocks, the one a long, ever-qualifying sentence for which no last words suffice, the other the briefest and most steadfast exercise in exclusion. The dead man is a rock carried by a river, a pebble borne by air, a sound carved into frequencies infrequently registered. More about the dead man's speech. The dead man is part of the chorus that sings the music of the spheres. Dead man's music uses the harmonics and parasitics of sound, in bands of low frequencies caught in ground waves that hug the terrain as they go, and in ultra-high megacycles that dent the ionosphere and refract over the horizon. The dead man makes no distinction between the music he hears and the music he only knows about. There are 5 elements in the dead man's music: time, tempo, key, harmony, and counterpoint, and 2 factors, silence and chance. To the dead man, the wrinkled back of a hand is a score to be read. The balding top and back of his head are a kind of braille awaiting a blind conductor. The dead man's bone sounds and teeth clacks are a form of tuning up. Sad music brings artificial tears to the dead man's dilated eyes. All things being equal, the dead man is not fussy about pitch and dissonance. His inner ear is set to hear euphonic consonants. The dead man sings in the shower, in good weather and bad, without knowing a song. He hums the tunes of commercials without the words, sympathetic vibrations. He has ideas for musical instruments made of roots and feathers, harps that use loose dirt, something like an interrupted hourglass. When the dead man, in a gravelly voice, sings gospel, hammers descend upon anvils. As you know, these are cumulative poems. That is, they'll keep a line going by accumulating more and more phrases about it. And there's a key line for me in most of the poems. Maybe this will help give it away in a sense. In the very first one, about the dead man, there's a line in part 2 that says, when there's no good or bad, no useful or useless, no up, no down, no right way, no perfection, then okay, it's not necessary that there be direction. Up is down. There's a line like that in almost every Dead Man poem.
That's right, there is, yeah. There's a long sort of statement that is full of paradox, basically, or expresses paradoxes, and yet, in a sense, resolves them.
Exactly. If when we're living as if when we're already dead,
all of
then
this
there
would
be
make
no
perfect
more.
sense. That's right.
All of this, yes. That's right. I do, excuse me, go on.
Well, I was going to say that there are some really lovely lines in here and I don't know if that's what you wanted or whether that's even appropriate in works like this, but I'm looking at number 9. To the dead man, fog is a mirror, a buttress against the distance. And the idea that's a beautiful idea, that fog can be mirror-like under certain circumstances for dead people.
That's true. Also, if you grow up on Long Island.
Yes.
It's true. People often say, who is the dead man? And I can't answer it because is he me? Yes. Is he not me? Yes. Is he everyone? Yes. Is he no one? Yes. You know, there are all these answers. But then the question leads to how much of this is biographical. And although things aren't put in a biographical way, lines and phrases come from somewhere. So,
yeah, it's, in a funny way, it seems to me that's the wrong question, because everything is biographical, in a sense. It had to be processed in some way through the mind of the person who's writing it.
Sure.
And it comes from experiences and thoughts and ideas and all kinds of things. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that it's a record of a life.
No, and certainly no one else can tell. If there's a reference in the poem about the dead man in government to a moment in a cafe in Sarajevo, a bar actually in Sarajevo, well, I know that. No one else has to. Those things which have come out of biographical memory are items which have, or I thought would have in these poems, some archetypal quality, some generalizing quality. So no one has to know that we lifted our glasses in a bar in Sarajevo years ago after my translator had been asked to ask me whether I was a Democrat or Republican, and I had said neither, an independent, and one of the fellows had said, anarquista, and had lifted his glass. So in the government poem, a line shows up that says, the dead man is the anarchist whose eyes look up through the glass raised in toast. Well, no one has to ever know. It's not important to know. It's not crucial. It's not significant to know that this comes from any biographic moment.
In fact, it would be misleading to know in a funny way, because the line is intelligible by itself.
I sure hope.
And if you refer it to a biographical incident, you think that's what it's about, when it's not necessarily what it's about at all.
That's right.
It is incidentally about that.
That's right.
But in a more fundamental sense, it's about what it says. It's about what it is.
You keep triggering memories for me. In the back of my mind, as we're speaking, keeps thinking about how did I come to write the Book of the Dead Man? And I remember something else. Being out here, 5 years ago, I guess it was, I started to come out here in between semesters. And David Ignatow was giving a reading at Caneo's. And I went, and we've known each other for a long time. And as we were splitting up for the evening, he said, write strong poems about death.
Did he really?
Yes, he did.
How about that?
Yeah.
He writes strong poems about love and sex, which is remarkable, since he's an elderly man. It's almost like Yeats, you know, who decided as he got older that he had missed something and he was going to, by God, catch up.
That's right. He went and got monkey glands.
Yes.
But I'm told it doesn't work.
No, I don't.
It works as long as you think it works.
It would be grotesque if it did, don't you think?
Well, things do tend to work by opposite. And, you know, it's very common that someone will not write about the place they lived until they live elsewhere, and vice versa.
We are, unfortunately, running out of time. This has been a wonderful half hour or hour. I think we ran to an hour, simply because we just got talking. I hope we can do this again sometime and continue our conversation as we do as often as we can anyway.
Next time I get to ask you more.
Oh, God.
Thank you, Tom.
Another reason I stopped writing poetry. And that's it.